Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to convene this session for the Taiwan Exhibition's series of seminars under the main project titled Impossible Dreams. This session looks into the intimate relationship between nature and history, the migration of species, peoples, and spirits, the cosmologies underlying social phenomena, and the values animating indigenous communities as they look after a range of resources. Ecology is imagined as an intense interaction. If situated within history or the context of time and space, it generates human action and social relations. Needless to say, ecology is a historical process, and the history of human action may threaten or enhance its own ecology. From the exhibition in Venice, two works converse with these issues. One is a set of works of Xie Tetching, presented in Venice in 2017, namely one-year performances and the jump piece. In these projects, time becomes a central element in performing the nature of history through an active and also vulnerable body. From 1978 to 1986, Xie conducted 5 of his well-known performances, including a year during which he punched a time clock every hour, a year of living outdoors, and a year spent tied to another person. In Jump Piece, the artist leapt from the second floor of his home and broke both of his ankles. He then destroyed the video records, leaving behind only the photographs. Another instance of intimate ecology within a global network of human movement is the work of Chien Chi Chang, presented in Venice in 2009. In the series Home, the artist evokes the lives of Chinese immigrants in New York's Chinatown, in which he considers his Taiwanese American heritage and migrant experiences of alienation and survival. We are fortunate today to have wonderful colleagues who will convey their thoughts on the anxieties of this session. They bring to our discussion frameworks and methods from art history, artistic practice, and the intersections between these two fields. Su Fang Tzu is a curator at the National University of Singapore Museum. She received her PhD in Cultural Studies at the National University of Singapore. She also served as the digital manager for Asia Art Archive from 2010 until 2013. She was then appointed as curator for the National Taiwan Museum of Fine Arts in Taichung in 2013. Her research projects include artist Lu Zihan's Artist General Assembly, the Langenbach Archive in 2013, Fields, an itinerant inquiry across the Kingdom of Cambodia in 2013, co-organized by the Sasa Basak in Cambodia and the St. Paul's Street Gallery in New Zealand. And on-site, a centennial retrospective of Robert Capa at the National Taiwan Museum of Fine Arts in 2013. In 2021, she curated with Kathleen Ditzig the exhibition Art Histories of a Forever War, Modernism Between Space and Home at the Taipei Fine Arts Museum, which revolved around the convergence of art, design, and technology during the Cold War. Yuma Taro is an Atayal woman from the Mabanan village in Miaoli County in Taiwan, who is also known as a traditional arts and culture preservationist and national living treasure. She previously worked as a civil servant and as a junior high school teacher, but later on went back to her community to revive the textile techniques of the Atayal people. In 1994, Yuma obtained her master's degree at the Graduate Institute of Textiles and Clothing at Fujian Catholic University. She later created the Lihang Workshop, which is dedicated to the preservation of the Atayal community's traditional clothing. Yuma received the National Living Treasure Award of Taiwan in 2016. Finally, Titre Provisoire is a collaboration of Kathleen Schuster and Marcel Dickhage, who are both based in Berlin. They have been working together since 2001. They have participated in various exhibitions and biennales such as the 8th Berlin Biennale in 2014 and the Singapore Biennale in 2019. Some of their projects include essay films, and site-specific video installations such as Between Spins, Stops, and Change of Direction in 2019, commissioned by the Singapore Biennale in 2019, and supported by the Goethe Institute Malaysia, Singapore, and IFA, Institute for Ausland Bisingungen. They have also produced publications like the booklet Some Things in Common Perhaps, published with the exhibition of the same title in 2018. One of their ongoing projects is the Coincidences of a Preposition, a publication program on shared discontinuities and experimental futures initiated together with the Philippine curator, Renan Laruan.
Before I start my presentation, I would like to express my gratitude for Professor Patrick Flores' invitation. I'm also very thankful for this opportunity to learn from all my distinguishing panelists and think through the question evolving around ecologies of history with them. I also like to thank the organizational effort of the Taipei Fine Art Museum and you for watching this presentation. What could ecologies of history mean? In our exchange, Patrick refers to ecology as natural context and as intensive interaction between humans and things. Here, the word of indicate relationships between ecologies and history, the turn of suggesting relationships between such as belonging or a point of reckoning. By taking the cue from Patrick and the creative liberty granted by the opportunity, I assume that Patrick's proposition is a historiographical one, especially with ecologies as plural and potentially imply a heterogeneous quality. Also, through frictions caused by intensive interactions, I believe the sense of history in this panel discussion would not fall into a kind of post-human platitude, and therefore compromise the historical and culture materialistic unfolding. Presumably, this occasion is a collective moment for a critical reflection on historical writing and on how history has been written through works of art and practice of art making in their cosmopolitical entanglements and in their ecologies of relations called history. If ecologies are both the content of history and methodological approach to examine the historical past, I suppose what lies at the core of ecologies of history is an attempt to rehistoricize the past as an intensive interaction between human and things in the present. Here, my presentation will be a reflection on recent exhibition titled Art Histories of Avoidable War, Modernism Between Space and Home. The exhibition is co-curated by Catherine Disick and myself, and it's an exhibition driven by our study of the modern artworks in the collection of Taipei Fine Art Museum, with a focus on the post-war era between 1950 to 1970s. For Catherine and myself, Art Histories of Avoidable War is an attempt to situate the collection of Taipei Fine Art Museum in the post-war geopolitical complexity, and the historicity constitute the formation of the museum. No museum is neutral. Since the inaugural of the public museum institution, Ashmolean in Oxford University 1677, museum has represented by what Mary Louise Pratt referred as contact zone. According to Pratt, she used this term contact zone to refer to, quote, social spaces where culture meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in context of highly asymmetrical relationship of power, such as colonialism, slavery, or their aftermath, as they are lived out in many parts of the world today, end quote. The condition of contact zone is particularly pronounced when one considers that Taipei Fine Art Museum has been built at the former site of United States Taiwan Defense Command. Here, the Taipei Fine Art Museum, as a representation of the contact zone, project an analytical potentiality to explore how the neo-colonial encounters in post-war Taiwan was mediated by the aspiration for modernity in searching for a homeland and a nationalhood. The plan to establish an art museum in Taipei was first introduced in 1976 as part of Taiwan's major construction project initiated by the central government of the Republic of China. The Taipei Fine Art Museum's identity had very much been crystallized during the preparation of the design competition for the museum's architecture. As indicated on the call for entry, the plan is to, quote, welcome a modern art museum that can accommodate the homegrown work of arts while expanding the international horizon, end quote. Simply put, Taipei Fine Art Museum is the first purpose-built exhibition space in Taiwan to house modern art when it opened on 8 August 1983. The representation of the museum being the house of modernism in and for Taiwan is also further iterated when one takes into account that the architect Gao Erpan's design concept of developing a Taipei Fine Art Museum as a vertical upward Siheyuan, a traditional Chinese courtyard house, and how exceptional such manifestation of Chinese modernism beyond the plaza style preferred by the central government. No museum is neutral, and neither does home. If we can all agree that what has been lurking underneath the warm and fuzzy perception of the typical bourgeois house is usually a sense of entanglement, excluding from the reality of gender inequality and emotional exploitation of domestic/care labor, the trope of home could be an analytical device helping us to understand forces of overlapping oppressions and power imbalance. Since Taipei Fine Art Museum sets up to be home of post-war Taiwan modern art and has been housing such a collection within an architectural masterpiece of Chinese modernism that represent a Siheyuan traditional courtyard house, home is no longer a metaphor, but a projection of traditional Chinese moral and cosmic order represented in an architectural design. Here, let me say a few words about art histories of a forever war, modernism between space and home. The exhibition foregrounds the modern art masterpieces housed in Taipei Fine Art Museum, including works of Li Yuanjia, Xiao Qin, Qin Song, Liu Guosong, Li Xiqi, and Han Xiangning, as well as works from beyond the collection by modernist architect Wang Dahong and Chen Qiquan. The exhibition foreground a pioneer generation of authors who relocate to Taiwan after the Second World War and urgently seek to develop a language of modern art that defines Chineseness. At once local and international in their vision, these artists and their works were at times employed towards legitimizing the Republic of China in Taiwan within the cultural and political landscape of the Cold War. Presented alongside the modern artwork are archival collections of case study on the moment of Cold War cultural diplomacy and exchange between Taiwan and modern artists and the war, and contemporary research-based artwork like by Erica Tan, Song Tu, Maria Taniguchi, Chen Yinlu, Pajata Pontes, Doris Wang Wei-Yan, Aya Rodriguez Izumi, Writing Factory in collaboration with Joy Ho and Joanna Ho and Elan. These contemporary projects point to the eluding legacy of this historical period and the lacuna of modern history by flashing out the complexity of lesser-known moments of Taiwan's modern art history and by literally foregrounding the artistic and technological tradition born out of the war and still define our everyday. The exhibition unpacks the complexity of this historical milieu through three distinct but intersecting themes: cosmotechnics after space race, global, domestic, and aesthetic networks of a free war. These themes are facets of this period of global history between 1940s to 1960s, wherein art, design, and technology converged in the service of war. There are also nexuses between this global art history and Taiwan's history of modern art. Under more techniques after space race, we draw the parallel between the space race and Chinese modern art movement in Taiwan. For global domestic, we explore the flow of convergence between the globalization and local handicraft made by traditional artisan and the modern paradigm of homemaking, land in aesthetic network. We examine the internationalized project of Taiwan's modern artists in this period. The phrase of free war, often used in propaganda, refers to Western Bloc and the networks of countries allied to United States. The Republic of China in Taiwan, being the front face of China, represent one of the front line of the Cold War. Modernity in this period was transformed by wartime techno-scientific development and the competition for cultural supremacy between US and Soviet Union. For the design of ballroom to visual and anthropology to cultural exchange programs that were based on belief that art could be the medium to build diplomatic understanding. Cultural production in this period was mediated by an interest in shaping human subject. If you are interested to find out more of this video, which is a short documentation about the exhibition, you can scan the QR code on the bottom. The manifestation of the human subject is always time and context-based bond. So as home. If house is an objectification of one's subject, the self is the subjectification of home. In one of the ancient Chinese philosophy classic title, The Great Learning, 大学, the concept of home is the sense of clan has been discussed as an essential mediation between the world and the thing via the mind and the sincerity of the human subject. Thanks to space race during the Cold War, the advancement of aerial photography enabled us to see our home planet Earth from outer space. Photographic images of astronauts hovering above the Earth or imageries of space photogeometry not only popularized via the Cold War propaganda poster, but also established a whole new extraterritorial perspective in the popular image. In the exhibition, exemplified by aesthetic impact of this introduction of planetary vision is a series of modernist painting and print created by artists who relocate to Taiwan during the Chinese Civil War. Home is constructed from a distance, and it is particularly true for this generation of modernist artists in Taiwan. They are searching for the lost homeland, their cultural responsibility of representing the authentic and historical Chineseness for the contemporary free world, and their aspiration for artistic modernity are rendered into their experimentations of ink and other Chinese symbols via modern visual languages. Here we can see these elements present in Liu Guosheng's Moonwalk, produced in 1969, which is a picture of astronaut was collages on top of the landscape consists of expressive ink and brushwork. In Han Shanglin's top-down left center, created in 1966, which includes oracle bone script in a square heaven and the rotundate earth composition. The similar reference of Chinese cosmology can also be seen in Orientation 6801 and Original Position Third. Both were created by Li Shiqi in 1968. Cosmotechnics, a term coined by philosopher Xu Yu, refers to a unification of moral and cosmic order through craft or art making. In this view, art practices like tool and technology does not just produce things, but are processes of work making. These examples of pursuing Chinese modernism by reinterpreting an ancient Chinese worldview are also quests of homemaking due to their displacement. The reappearing of several artists in more than one thing speaks to how this forever war interwoven with our historical experiences. The inclusion of works from different moments in their artistic career not only facilitate and expanded historical reading of their individual artistic evolution, but also render conceptual ties between the theme visible. This exemplified by double bill of Chen Shiquan in Cosmo Techniques After the Space Race. Chen's 90-degree curve, produced in 1967, depicts his memory of a fly during his military service in 1944. In this ink painting that nearly 2 meters long, Chen actualized an aerostatic vision through classical Chinese ink painting technique. Chen's work offers a poetic counterproposal to the scientific visuality represented by the reproduction of NASA's photography and posters that was shown in the same gallery of the exhibition. In Global Domestic, Chen's Yin Yang 2, produced in 1985, a 5.5 meter long painting mounted in the format of hand scroll resembles an imaginary journey into a Shiheyuan Chinese traditional Korea house in Yunnan. Unlike this traditional Chinese landscape, emphasizing on the exteriority of the scene through elaborated brushwork and composition, Chen's Yin Yang No. 2 actualized the interior structure that of is both physical and metaphysical. It extends the visual narrative of traditional Chinese ink painting by inviting the viewer to read the painting by moving horizontally from left to right. This vision imagines a domestic as a microcosm that is part of the wider world. In Chinese art historian Li Jingzhu's reading of Chen Shiquan's work, he identified Chen's application of depicted geometry in his painting. By highlighting a visual technique commonly used by architect and designer, we can see how Chen mobilized modern perspective from the aerial to the domestic in his attempt to represent words and enduring resonance of this historical period upon how artists saw and depicted a home in the war. A work of art or an artist's creative expression is entangled in complex relations. Here, this entanglement situates between the history of art making, the social political reality of homemaking, and the technologies of word making. Juxtaposing with the extraterritorial perspective and the objectification of our home planet Earth is another entanglement between art making, homemaking, and word making under the theme of global domestic. Archival material relate to Asian artists in Crystal exhibition in 1956, and Russell Wright's endeavor to introduce Taiwan and Southeast Asian art craft to America household are presented. First opened in 1956 at the National Art Gallery in Washington, D.C., Asian Artists in Crystal was an exhibition of 36 decorative crystals based on drawings by modern Asian artists. A form of Cold War cultural diplomacy undertaken by the United States, the exhibition seeks to demonstrate that the East and West can work together. Asian Artists in Crystal featured the work of 3 artists from Republic of China, Zhou Junyong, Ma Shouhua, and Lan Yinding. In 1958, an edition of the replica of the crystal was given to the Republic of China in Taiwan. Art History of a War present these replicas for the first time since 1958, alongside reproduction of the original drawing and example of how the crystals were translated into other contexts as object of cultural diplomacy, arts, and decoration for the modern home. In 1955, Life magazine featured Asian import to America. The magazine focused primarily on the textile from India, Thailand, Hong Kong, and how those textiles were being used to produce new American fashion. The feature was an example of how Asian craft was being incorporated into American modern design. A parallel to the craft and design from Taiwan and Southeast Asia that Russell Wright tried to bring to American market. In this session, we also showcase photos of Russell Wright's visit to Nantou Training Center, later became the National Taiwan Craft Research and Development Institute, feature numbers of Taiwan artists. Here is a picture of Yan Shuilong, who was the director of the center and at the time and has been known as the father of modern craft movement in Taiwan. Through these two sets of archival material, what could be unfold is a sense of Cold War Orientalism that has been theorized by historian Christina Klein as a construction of aesthetic experiences by American middle-class household. In this context, the word making of proxy America was literally practiced by modern homemaking in an act of collecting Oriental crafts created by the colored artists in capital O and curated those objects in their modern home. To conclude, I would like to discuss our curatorial position through Erica Tan's Barong Barong. Barong Barong is a Malay word used colloquially in Singapore. It means things, many things. The title connotes both the burden of things and the legacy of things we carry with us. A composition installation that includes many different individual works. Barong Barong is a loose interpretation of an artist studio and an expanded consideration of the material and things that Erica Tan inherited from her mom. Fei Tan. Fei Tan was an artist that studied at National Nanyang Fine Art at the Nanyang Art Academy. The central sculpture element of that foregrounds this display is based on Fei Tan's full poster bed, which was constructed from colonial timber telegraphone pole that she bought in Singapore in the 70s. Suspended from it are sculpture of coconut core and rubber latex, material that were essential for the development of Singapore as the important node in the globalized system of communication and trade, while recalling artist studio with its diverging range of material from catalog to personal artifact to on-frame, painting, and installation take on the vocabulary of museum display. The material on display contextualize Fei Tan's historical milieu as well as speculatively writing her into a broader art history with three other female artists, Kim Lin, Georgia Chen, and Dora Godin. Spectral Entanglement, one of the four videos on display, imagines a meeting between this woman and their possible conversation and interaction as artist, woman, and transnational interlocutor. Evidence in Erica Tan's caption, their personal trajectory with different Asian national art history, form connection, and entanglements which point less to coincidence than to patterns of inferences, circulation, and networks. Through the fiction meeting between four female artists, Erica Tan points to lacunas in existing modern art history. Barong Barong exists at the interactions of history of technology, art history, and personal family history. In Art History of Forever War, Erica's Barong Barong allow us to envision alternative methodologies that challenge the way histories of modern art are written and to imagine a feminist perspective of making a home in the world. Thank you.
Wahagi pinagkahayan Ulan itataya Ilahi hamud makiano Nakakusani ka kumakaya Kaya kerang pahapag Ilkoyahit makalkayano Tataluki ba nagis ka Rasani how kumahoy Oh, ay, abadaudo
Nya baku dan ni umatku itu nya baku haninya lah. Ani ku ramilnya ramilnya muhi haja laga lokah haninya lah muah.
Hani ya lakau je.
Ikutan ta saya orang ayat. Teta unta hani lah. Teta unta hani daru musa sajing ruga musa cuban lah hani.
Cuban ho.
Kutan hani. Teta unta.
Hani ya.
Hani laga hani ujiru kutan hani ru.
Baku.
Hani kutan ya hani ru hani laga. Atung ku.
Yang hani lega utuh lega.
Utum sekan. Rara li utus kanti.
Jadi tayan lega tahan tadah lah.
Oh.
Jadi bukan yang ada ya.
Oh, tasik sebayan hani. Oh, dah kita dah.
Mungkin tasik kah?
Tasik.
Adi adi kira kawas gam apa isu ya?
Ana gam hatu ngam takan mo ya ya mo. Tu rahu kung gam tuk mo dah. Kung sa medyo ya mo mo.
Oh ini.
Tak mazah ru.
Ya.
Au.
Isu.
Itu hati di itu hani tanak kita dah hani tak.
Itu yang
Au, kena eno hani lah.
Oh.
Tanak kan kau lagi lebih lagi. Cuma hani dah itu mo itu kita. Oh, kita ni dah. Siya kasahnya. Ang kami sumia. Yang gua ada ka yung kani mo kini.
Nanu semiya ki.
Nanu sang kani ro ta. Bahan ni.
Yang hani lega ni pergi ku urau lah.
Nanu bahan nanu urawayan asada.
Ya perhana kakai lah.
Iya, na apa dan juga dai iki. Wah, nanak ro. Anak tahwi hadir atunga tuang cika ina.
Ya ki sananu kemani nyusuk piaung kan ya.
Kagi.
Kam kagi ka.
Oh.
Tenak kana ku ara ikin hakun dum saya ka.
Au. Kagi muka. Raja na hadukus. Ya iku. Basta beli ya kagi tahanita. Laura ra. Ya. Rugi suki. Kasi nakimita ni sa klase kami. Sino ba? Layu tapi. Umah kujih di rumah umah ba uji. Ane itu mau daging kita. Isi kileun makan ni kayu mak tak.
排队要排好。Apa aktivare itu tuh? Lain rumah kami di sini. Lalu tahu.
Manok ya cantik manok. Hani. Bingung sa hani lah. Makanya ya. Nana kasi karisan sa kunuan hanya asa. Usus uzip laki uzip ta. Hani. Iya, jam kasih sang kanila ta. Ta. Si hugal si kay sang asa. Asi kakay so ani. Sika hani ko dun.
Kani koyamu hak saun kani koyamu hak saun kani koyamu hak saun kani tamato saun kani tamato saun kani tamato saun kani mamuhe saun kani kumamuhe saun kani kumamuhi saun kani kuramihon saun kani kuramihon saun kani kuramihon saun kani kuramilay saun kani kuramilay saun kani kuramilay saun kani kuraruma saun kani kuraruma saun kani kuraruma saun kani kumakagi saun kani kumakagi saun kani kumakagi saun kani kumanoka saun kani kumaraho saun kani kumaraho saun kani kupahapo saun kani kupahapo saun kani kupahapo saun kani kumanuka saun kani manuka saun kani manuka saun kani kumatisa saun kani kumatisa saun kani kumatisa saun kani kumanarod saun kani kumanulod saun kani kuhamulod saun kani kuyamuhak saun kani kuyamuhak saun kani kuyamuhak saun kani tanato saun kani tanato saun kani tamato kani kuyamuhak saun kani kuyamuhak saun kani kuyamuhak saun kani tamato saun kani tamato saun kani tamato saun kani mamuhe saun kani kumamuhe saun kani kumamuhe saun kani kuramihon saun kani kuramihon kani kusamilay. Saun kani kuraruma, saun kani kuraruma, saun kani kuraruma. Saun kani kumakagi, saun kani kumakagi, saun kani kumakagi. Saun kani kumanoka, saun kani kumabaho, saun kani kumabaho. Saun kani kupahapo, saun kani kupahapo, saun kani kupahapo. Saun kani kumanuka, saun kani manuka, saun kani manuka. Saun kani kumatisa, saun kani kumatisa, saun kani kumatisa. Saun kani kumalawod, saun kani kumalawod, saun kani kuhamulod.
ayen kemaya boh aras mumushin lahib qiwai qalqalahaji Wahagi binagahayan tunufubunaya lahi hamud makiano nakakusani kakumakayan yakiran bahabag ilkoyahit makalkiano tadaluki ba nakisga rasani hau kumahoy
Thank you so much to Patrick Flores and the Taipei Fine Arts Museum for the invitation to this forum and for the chance to revisit some of our research work from recent years. I'm Marcel.
I'm Kathleen.
And we will both be presenting some of our research here. In this presentation, we will examine the history of German colonialism, amongst other, so please be advised that some content might be disturbing. By way of responding to the ecology of history, from the content of our own work and research, we would like to take up a definition of ecology by Raymond Williams. In Keywords, a vocabulary of culture and society, Williams describes the close connection between the meanings of ecology and economy, both verbally rooted in the Greek oikos, with the meaning of ecology as habitat coming only subsequently. Understanding ecology, both in close relation to economy and as habitat, seems to be a generative starting point for reflecting on the crisis of the planet. Is the economy the ecology of human nature, and can it be defined as its habitat? But doesn't the economy destroy its very habitat, namely the Earth? Can we even conceive and shape our habitats non-economically? How can we understand history as part of this ecology?
We would like to start by situating ourselves within the subject of the ecology of history. For this, we have assembled two fragments from Patrick Flores' essay about these forums, and we will be highlighting how they have spanned a conceptual space for us. Firstly is his idea of the seminar as providing an opportunity for us to add an, quote, elusive proposition in a time of internal and all-over crisis, end of quote. As Patrick notes, in the field of medicine, the term crisis defines a critical state, namely a critical condition, in relation to the processing or the treatment of a disease. But this can also be applied in relation to the state of our planet. The planetary crisis is sustained by methods that in brief are grounded in the economic principles and mechanisms of colonial and racial capitalism. These mechanisms include extractivism and destructivism, as well as the will to dominate and possess land, nature, and the animal kingdom. In order to understand these mechanisms, one needs to take into account white supremacy and colonization, speculative financialization and the debt economy, and the subordination of subjects on the basis of race, gender, and class. Considering these factors, we feel a deep disconnection, alienation, or displacement in our daily lives from what should be a close connection between nature and history.
Secondly, Patrick describes the seminar as a chance to recover an origin. History as the history that is inscribed in common knowledge is made in relation to and with those who write and circulate it, or do not circulate it. As such, history is vulnerable to ideology and power, and it remains precarious in its status of truth, always incomplete or in constant need of being processed and reprocessed. This is especially true for the historiography of colonial history in Germany, which until recently was not even taught in German schools. But history also exists as a gap, as well as also being as yet unprocessed histories. Doing research on German colonialism in Southeast Asia, we came across the text of Susanne Santop. Santop was a German-American scholar and political scientist. She was born in Germany in 1945 and moved to the US to study political science at Stanford, and was later professor of comparative literature and chair of the Department of German Studies at Dartmouth College. She describes the intellectual preliminaries of colonialism in Germany, including, for example, the enormous overproduction of travelogues. One of her books was first published in English in 1997 by Duke University Press, entitled Colonial Fantasies: Conquest, Family and Nation in Pre-Colonial Germany, 1770 to 1870. The German edition from 1999 includes an appendix with over 900 reference texts. Here she herself notes that her state of knowledge in reflecting on German colonialism is situated in 1995, a time when many historical facts were only just beginning to be processed. Interestingly, she does not limit the era of German colonialism purely to the period of the official historiography from 1884 to 1919, to quote from her introduction. In fact, the short history of Germany's imperialism, from the establishment of colonies in Southwest Africa, Togo, Cameroon, East Africa and the Pacific in the 1880s, to the loss of these colonies as a result of World War I, was preceded by a long history of small-scale colonial ventures, large-scale colonist theories, and a myriad of colonial fantasies from the 16th century onward." End of quote. She investigates the emergence of latent colonialism as an unspecific drive for colonial possession, showing how a colonialist subjectivity emerged in Germany as early as the 1770s, during the so-called colonial political half of the 18th century, and how it grew into a collective obsession by the late 1800s. In her analysis of German colonial fantasies, she draws from tales, novels and plays, scientific articles, philosophical essays, and political pamphlets, children books and entertainment for adults.
To bridge the gap prior to the 1870s, when Germany lacked either nation-state or colonial policy, Santop specifically focuses on fantasies and imaginary formations rather than actions. The fantasies existed without the borders of a nation-state, and representations of the South Sea in the 19th century always contained a Eurocentric view. Authentic dialogues between natives and Europeans that are introduced in several South Sea texts are, in reality, fictitious and constructed. The thoughts and feelings of native people are represented entirely in the language and thought system of the Europeans. In various genres of South Sea representations, anti-European and mission-critical statements are often placed directly next to proto-Darwinist and pro-colonialist statements. With her analysis, Santop challenges the idea that imagination is something innocent. She gives imaginary formations the role of driving factors for colonialist projects and activities. Even today, the South Seas continue to exist in Germany as an example of exoticism. Take for one the frequent use of islands or the South Sea in German pop songs, like Monotonie by the new wave band Ideal, which was released in 1981. Over the course of our own research, we visited, among other archives, the Bundesarchiv Lichterfelde in Berlin, which hosts the former political archive of the Federal Foreign Office, Politisches Archiv des Auswärtigen Amts. Part of the difficulty in researching colonialism in Germany is down to the fact that there are no central archives. Each state, such as Bremen, Hamburg, and Berlin, has its own archive, some of which were dissolved and later integrated into other archive bodies at some point in time. The Political Archive is a memory of the Federal Foreign Office and holds the records of German foreign policy since 1867. In this case, where the actual reading room of the Political Archive is in Berlin-Mitte, the files on the colonial administration, Kolonial- und Besatzungsverwaltung, are located in Berlin-Lichterfelde. The archive is located in a building that looks like a military complex, and it turns out to be a former Prussian cadet school, where officers of the empire took their exams. Having closed in 1920, and after various interim uses, the SS moved there in 1933, followed in 1945 by first Soviet troops and shortly after US forces, who stayed here until 1994. The person at the entrance registered us for the day and showed us the way across the campus to a row of buildings at the back. Was the viewing room on the ground floor? We can't remember. Neither can we remember if we had to leave our bags or jackets in lockers. We were able to take our phones into the room to take photos, and we went through the files, sitting at a desk under daylight lamps.
Two of the figures in our research are the German natural scientists Anna and Karl Semper. Karl Semper was the nephew of the architect Gottfried Semper. As so-called explorers, they used the colonial infrastructure of their time to investigate various parts of Southeast Asia between 1859 and 1865. During this time, they produced a huge number of drawings and written papers about the natural and plant worlds, including some about butterflies, snails, sea animals, and the movements of waves. Many of the drawings were made by Anna Semper and are stored in the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard University and in the Smithsonian libraries. At the same time, Karl Semper produced writings with ethnographic descriptions of the native populations of these islands, placing them in a normative Western narrative. The Semper's voyages were marked by several failures, such as a shipwreck on Palau that resulted in a one-year stay on the island. Another failure was being denied entry to the inland of Mindanao due to Karl Semper's lack of shoes after they were stolen by pirates. Nonetheless, Anna and Karl Semper participated in colonial science. Their explorations were not commissioned, neither by an anthropological society nor by a trading company or colonial society. It was their decision. Semper sold his large collection of ethnographic objects from the Philippines and Palau to the director of what is today's Dresden State Art Collection, Staatliche Kunstsammlung Dresden. These objects included, for example, Palau beams. Around 1900, Karl Semper's travelogues and books were denigrated when ethnologists in Germany became more professional and started to distance themselves from amateur ethnographers. Perhaps their practice is evidence of an early form of artistic research. Pieces from Semper's collection were exhibited in the Moritzburg Castle in Dresden between 1909 and 1911, which in turn contributed to the development of the painting style of the Brücke school of painters. The artistic expansion and travel journeys of the Brücke artists, for example to Palau or to islands in the Bismarck Sea in Papua New Guinea, can be traced back directly to the colonial fantasies that Susanne Santop describes, of which Semper's travel reports and artifacts are prime example.
Santop analyzes yet another similar form of relationship between the history of ideas and the history of colonialism. The problematic metaphorical status of the island, being that of a synonym to the colony, has been deeply inscribed in the history of European discourse since the Enlightenment. A prominent example can be found toward the end of the analytic part of Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Kant uses the exploration of the island of truth to affirmatively define the search for knowledge as colonial appropriation. Susanne Santop describes how Kant constructs the knowledge seeker not as an inhabitant of the island, but as a seafarer who comes from afar. Quote, and rather than seeking to understand and share the island with others, he surveys, stakes out his claims, and takes possession of it, against competing claims, before he ventures forth to ever more distant shores. Even though Kant is speaking only about mental conquests and intellectual terrain, his choice of metaphor reveals the pervasiveness of the island fantasy in late 18th century discourse, and the extent to which theory has become complicitous with practical colonialism through discursive practices. End of quote. The discourse is ideologically distributed as an accomplice of real colonialism and renders expansionist fantasies as natural phenomena. Such preparatory work may not have been an insignificant factor in enabling the brutality of the German colonial period, especially in regard to its direct and immediate availability.
This availability of brutality, such as the blatant claiming of lands, the accompanying crimes up to and including genocide, was widely reported by English-language newspapers. Many such articles can be found in the archives. In one of the articles we saw the urge to compete, and so behavior driven by economics was used as an explanation. Since the Germans became an official colonial power only later, when many parts of the world were already divided among other powers, they entered the conquest, all the more competitive and brutal. We found this argument quite striking. It has led us to a broader analysis of the contemporary role of competition and economic interests in the neoliberal environment compared to its historical colonial antecedent. Of course, competition is just one part of a larger problem, containing many other factors which must be added for a fuller conception. In our ongoing searches for traces, we have understood it as a small but significant factor in our research on the history of expansive global capitalism. The research we have presented in part here, mainly carried out in 2018 and 2019, has been translated into the film installation Between Spins, Stops and Change of Directions, commissioned by the Singapore Biennial in 2019. The film reveals the gathering of agents and conditions of colonialism and globalization as they meet at the junction of current movements for resistance and sustainability. Following that work, and in the meantime, we have developed a long-term research project and attendant publication together with Renan Larouan. It is in this constellation that we assemble the online journal Rosa Mercedes 4 with the title Coincidences in Prepositions, hosted on the Harun Farokhi Institute website.
Our search for the larger problem must also include ourselves and the question of what shapes us as capitalist subjects. For Rosa Mercedes 4, we have assembled and studied different works and writings that have been crucial in providing a more thorough examination of these issues, including the work by Goubin Lan, in which she assembles a reflexive politics of decolonization, with an examination and comparative reflection on oneself or one's own behavior. The ethics of disengagement from the will and the emancipatory act of decentering, dispossessing, and dissolving the self, as analyzed by Rada Ivekovic, has also become central, as too has the analysis by Ai Waong on the dissemination of neoliberal interventions and its techniques of administration, as much as the ethics of resistance by, for example, Malay factory women. These became very important vectors of reference for us in the task of further analyzing and understanding the historical entanglements of the economic environment within our contemporaneous habitat and everyday lives, enabling us to think as much as possible about undoing their consequences.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So welcome everyone.
Greetings from Manila. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to the discussion of the session titled "The Ecologies of History." It is my pleasure as well to welcome the participants of this session, Su Fangtse, Yumataru, and Titre Proviswa, consisting of Kathleen Schuster and Marcel Dickhage. So they are from different time zones, and we're fortunate to be able to gather them today. When I thought of the theme Ecologies of History, I was thinking of how the two terms, ecologies and history, can be brought together and overcome possibly a dualistic basis of world making. So that was my intention, how to bring ecology and history together and create a framework that goes beyond the binary opposition between ecology and history. So this is some kind of experiment of thinking through practice, right? We received, of course, beautiful propositions from the participants, and the common motif or the common thread is that the ecology is seen as a condition of nature, which is both essence and also quality. So I think this is important, no? That nature is both essence and quality. And in the presentations, we see the natural as translated in terms of the indigenous, and we see this in the work of Yuma, and also the natural as the earth and the planet, and also as habitat. So in other words, the natural, in the discussion of the natural, there seems to be a sense of intimacy with in the discussion of ecology, there seems to be an intimacy with the natural. And thus there is a production in this intimacy with the natural. There is a production of fantasy, and I think the Marcel and Kathleen beautifully foregrounded this notion of the fantasy and also of the possibility of an exoticism, no? Or the imagination or the fiction of the self and also of the other. But furthermore, ecology is remediated as home, and we can see this in the presentation of Fangtse, and the politics and process of domestication, and the attention to relations. Thus we see the roles of women and gender, and also the subject of the primitive. No? So I think this has something to do with the fantasy also of affinity and of relations. And secondly, there is a sense of science, no? And technology, a method of investigation, or a research into resources, no? A research into resources, which brings us to the notion of the economy, which is raised by Marcel and Kathleen. The economy and its difficult exchanges. No? So Fangtse it was interesting for Fangtse to say that ecology becomes a historiographic question. No? Ecology becomes a historiographic question. And reflexively, we can also say that history becomes an ecological question. No? So I think this is the challenge, no? Of this moment of thinking, how to go beyond the binarism of just ecology on the one hand and history on the other. And also from Kathleen and Marcel, we see also a proposition that the formation of nature, or the formation of the natural and material condition, is also the formation of the subject. No? Is the formation of the subject. And so the intimacy with the self, for instance, the intimacy of the self with in the neoliberal framework, no? And also the transformation of the self in critical theory. So yeah, so these are the this is a broad framework of the session, and now I go through the questions now, and I state them now. So the first one is reviewing your practice over the years, as you have in various ways tried to reference the social context of the historical forces at work in any given situation. How do you think were you able to implicate nature as part of the ecology of this context? Through what media, techniques, research models were you able to stage or perform nature in your historical work? So I'd like to begin with Yuma. I'm sure she will be able to beautifully evoke a creative context for this question. So Yuma.
我应该是这么说，我们因为大家一起新的见面，那如果在泰雅族传统的方式的话，我要用一个歌谣的仪式来祝福跟开始我们这个谈话是可以的吗？可以唱一首歌吗
？Sure, sure. We would love that. Yeah, Yuma, please.
Anasan Musai no Rashi Sami Imlu Wagi Kwaralu Gaumen Samila Isu Aling sami ami anu isu jo malahan wan sami wai magan ilungan su.
Thank you very much.
他的意思是说，在这个开始见面的生命，不管是遇到什么样的生命，我们都希望能够就是我们的主灵能够带领我们去我们今天所要去到的所有的道路，因为我们是你的孩子，所以你会让我们走到最顺利的道路上。那因为我其实不是一个纯粹的艺术家，所以我有很多的不同的身份。我是一个就是民族工作的一个研究者，所以我是研究的性质很多那我也是一个就是我们民族的传统织品的一个保存者，所以我也有一个程序这个延续这个历史的一个重要的身份。那其实我也是一个巫师家族，所以我也必须要去沟通，就是协助自然跟土地还有人之间关系的一个角色，所以我不是一个单纯的艺术创作者。所以 Patrick 问我的问题，其实它不是一个问题，它是一个很自然的一个表达方式。那我们只是把我们在环境里头体会的，或者是在我们跟很多的老人家在一起之后，我们体会到的一个很重要的一个民族的世界观或人生观，把它做视觉的表达而已。所以如果以我的一个作品叫做生命的回旋的这个创作，它其实有很多不同的阶段，所以他在用很多不同的阶段去表达一个人在这个环境里头所必须要做到的一个本分。比如说这个系列作品的第一件作品是在讲人的初始，所以我们泰雅族人一出生他就会有第一件人生的织品，就是包裹他的身体的那件襁褓布，然后那件襁褓布 一般来讲，很多的族群都会把它做得非常的华丽，但是泰雅族都会把它做得很平凡，然后很坚韧。它就是希望你的生命来到这个土地上，来到这个空间，你就必须要很强韧的，因为泰雅族没有阶级，所以他要靠自己的能力去得到他的在社会上的位置。所以我们就有第一块的强保护。那因为我今年60岁了，所以我有一块布是跟着我到现在，所以我有一块我从出生开始就有的布。所以在不同的阶段、不同的年龄，我们就有一块对应自己生命的布料。比如说，到了13、14岁，我们要成年了，所以我们就有一块，女生就会有一块裙子，男生会有一块披肩，代表你开始要去面对这个环境了，所以你必须要是一个自主的人，所以有一块布就会对应你现在的一个状态。然后到了17、18岁，你就是要结婚了，所以作为一个织者，你就必须要拥有所有的技能，然后把所有这个布料的意义都要学习到位。所以我的作品大概就是在这个不同的阶段里头去呈现视觉化我们的人生观这样。所以到当代的，就是现在我的作品就是反映我现在这个年龄，我60岁了，所以我是部落的耆老，所以我必须要拥有一个如同布料一样柔软的舌头。原因是因为我必须要将我过去的经验跟智慧能够开始传承给底下的孩子们，让他们遇到各种问题的时候可以来请教。那我们可以用舌头一样的柔软的包容性，如布料一样的柔软的包容性去就是包纳他们所有的困难，然后解决他们的问题。所以最近在做的作品就是怎么样去表达对于传统的这些智慧跟想象，然后我们怎么样把自然的线性的这些材料跟科技的这个材料怎么去互相应用表达。所以等一下就是这个讨论结束之后，我就要去做这件事情。所以现在这个作品就是怎么样表达语言的一个透明感，然后语言的传递讯息的这个概念在这个作品里面。所以它其实是有很多的考验跟去尝试。对，所以我会想把自己对于跟过去这些历史性的脉络整合起来，也就是 Patrick 在问我的这个问题，其实对我来讲是一个需求的表现，而不是为了艺术创作而创作的概念。就是我内心蓄积了这样子大的能量，所以我必须要表达出来，然后我就做表达。
Thank you, Yuma. Thank you for that beautiful answer. Yeah. So, Marcel and Kathleen, you'd like to speak to the question?
Yes, thank you. So I think in our case, we wanted to, problematize nature. Its status and condition, let's say, that it has. And like, for example, we started in our presentation with the analysis and how nature as an imaginary, as you also said in your introduction, this imaginary force, that it was developed through how Susanne Santop tried to show in her book, as a method to speculate on something in the times of German colonialism, and surely not only German colonialism, but in general. And so for us, it's difficult in a way to answer your question in that way, because it's not something not yet unmediated, or there's already some kind of, I don't know, it was used in text and projections and images and novels in these travelogues to enhance and to get this drive what Susanne Santop describes, an unspecific drive for colonial possession, get it into the people. I don't know how to put it better. So I think for us it's important to have this kind of analytical position to it, and to look at it, what was made, to and why it should not be a harmless, for example, the island, why it should not just be a harmless metaphor, but it really has a problematic meaning in the European context or so. And then also, for example, the European discourse, it's very important also to us that these ideas can be reappropriated, right? I mean, for example, and turned around also, for example, through Ramon Guillermo, the Filipino scholar and activist, and the way we got to know it also through his work. He did this PhD about the untranslatability of the German word Natur into the Tagalog language, but then also the need to reconstruct the meaning inside of what it had, what Natur can maybe develop via different local concepts, to be able to use its revolutionary force also, which is what José Rizal did when he wrote Noli Me Tangere, after also he visited Germany and Europe for a longer period of time. So we like how Ramon is like trying to flip this kind of let's say Naturzustand, the problematic state of nature, into something else. And yet for us, it's important to have a critical position and reflection on it, I would say.
Yeah. Also, we mentioned Raymond Williams with his important link between ecology and economy, and how this is linked together, and the restructuring, exploiting the earth, transporting goods, leaving noxious emissions and hardly decomposable substances around. I mean, this is constantly something, of course, we have faced every day now, and we're working on since a while. And the second part, actually, the second part of the question.
The second part of your question of the media and techniques, so, like what we described now was the research, which is one part of our work, a huge part. But then we are doing films and also other photographs and so on. And in this work, nature also sometimes appears, sometimes not, but usually in all works there's related something to it. Through, the text, the characters in our film, because we work with characters and performers. So again, it's not in a direct way, it's mediated. And so it appears, we would say, in relation to the precarious condition that it has at the moment. It's, in our sense, it has in general, as you said also in your introductory text, the planetary crisis. I mean, it has it's precarious, let's say. So I don't know if we should give some.
It's great. It's great. Great answer. It's in the case of Yuma, it's nature comes by way of some kind of ancestral cosmology, and that is the access to it, and then she expresses it, through textile and through other forms. In your case, nature is seen as a problem, or a problematization, right? And it takes on a discursive form through an analysis of imaginative production over the years, and as can be seen in the archives. So
Yeah.
And then the medium is research, and through research there is some kind of exhibitionary form or a performative form as well. No? And it's interesting that Yuma and Marcel and Kathleen are all in a way researchers, no? Ethnographers. Yuma began with that she is not an artist in the professional sense, but other things besides, no? Like ethnographer and preserver of culture and shaman, for instance. So so that's an interesting. This is an interesting constellation of how research can be, rethought as a medium, no? as a medium in contemporary art. And of course, Fang Tzu is a professional academic and curator. So I'm sure you have things to say about this, Fang Tzu. So your turn.
I feel relatively inadequate in this particular conversation. I'm located in Singapore, which is an island. It's a native forest. How should I put it? It's completely deforested due to the colonial force, British colonial force in the late 18th century, early 19th century. So talking about this topic, thinking about staging or performing nature, I think unlike Uma and unlike Kathleen and Marcel, I think you both propose a very critical question in thought. How do we encounter nature through this unpack its different modality of time? I mean, in a sense, yes, we're interfacing with history. However, I think Uma does propose this different sense of time, modality of time, thinking about oral history, thinking about a central connection, thinking about memory, and thinking about, I think, the notion of the past and present. I mean, obviously, it's a very different modality of time when it's compared with what Kathleen and Marcel proposed. I think a sense of time, what I perceive in your presentation, your sharing, is a kind of a sense of time as a result, a colonial sense of time as a result of epistemology of civilization, in a sense that very much kind of linked to unfortunate circumstances where I located in my profession, which is museum, and I'm dealing with museology. So from my own perspective, thinking about a wonderful proposition from Patrick, I was quite intrigued with the term Patrick. It feels like an oral examination from a professor with questions, but a very, very generous one, full of creativity and warm invitation, because you invite us to think about ecology as imaginated, intensive interaction between human and non-human. And I think another keywords you have pointed out is, in fact, in your introduction video, it's actually about anxiety of the present. It's actually about anxiety of present. And I think in your own work, Patrick, you have been continuously theorizing the term of the curatorial. So I think it can only do a justice if I go back to your own text and thinking about how the curatorial in the region of Southeast Asia, which is also a historical result of that epistemology or epistemological mechanism of civilization, which is from European kind of civilization enlightenment idea. The region has been born, and what exactly is the role of the curatorial in the contemporary practices? Which you rightly put, Patrick, you emphasize in multiple of your work, including your publication, Past Peripheral. You mentioned how the curatorial is this self-reflexivity and the sense of awareness of the positionality. And I think rightly put, thinking about our job in the role of the curatorial, dealing with a certain, the notion and knowledge formation of museology in a sense, can never take away the dust of colonialism of our practices. And hence, instead of thinking about, am I, as a curator, able to stage or perform nature in my historical work? I think for me, the question will have to do, and will have to rearticulate itself into how nature being naturalized by culture in the context, for instance, in Singapore, or in the broader context of the formation of the nation state. And I think this is quite precisely the conundrum of our work as the curator in the region and under the pressure of rising Asia, whether it's still rising or is in this moment of collective anxiety. So I think in a sense from our own work in the museum or from my own curatorial work, when it comes to unpack how nature has been naturalized by culture. I mean, one of the dimensions from the collective of communities and the community I've been working with, because when we think about curator, it was actually never been one single person. And it's actually a team of people with professional training from collection perspective, from collection management, and from people who are taking care of the artifacts. So it has always been a team of effort, a kind of collective effort. So I think from this particular genealogy, thinking about the role of the curatorial, and this from my experiences with NUS Museum as a college and university museum, I think what we have been always emphasized is this notion of cultural biography of object. I mean, in which the curatorial's role in this particular process is obvious to not evaluate or in conversation with the object in the context of exhibition, thinking about the provenance of the object as the ownership of a person, but the provenance of the object have to do with its situatedness through different intersection with different historical moments. And I think from that, I can also then give a more concrete example. Since so far, I think my explanation has to be, unfortunately, been very abstract. But I just want to propose a very unique object we have in NUS Museum, recently accessed into the collection, which is a set of teak samples, teak wood sample, which has been compiled in the moment of the arrival of the colonizer in the 18th century, thinking about the colonial process beginning in this particular piece of land called Singapore in this moment. The first thing that we'll have to do is to understand the forest, and hence by presenting and creating a specimen. And I think that's the processes in the kind of economical sense, from potentially Michel de Santos' words that would be what we refer as scripture economy, which means by giving name to whatever essence or whatever being it has been transcended into part of the economic circulation. I think it's very particularly true when a particular kind of wood acquires its name, acquires its position in the taxonomy, which is a knowledge system, which is also hierarchical knowledge system. It has also become the object of economical circulation in its 18th century of time. It's obvious the colonial and the global expansion of circulation. And I mean, the object biography also leads us to think about whether the object belongs to the context of collection. The power of collection also requires whether this particular object will be able to resonate with the identity of the museum. So what happened is the establishment of the country and the arrival of the nation state leads to the deaccession of the object, which means the object, the A box of teak sample, confronting this moment of deaccession in the museological term, which means the collection item is no longer belong to the collection, or is irrelevant, which means it also doesn't have any meaning in the collection itself. So interesting enough was to look at this particular cultural biographical journey of the teak wood, which in fact, in the natural sense of time, the specimen doesn't have life. However, I think what is all the function of the curatorial with its own reflexive awareness is to continuous thinking about and continuous re-examine that particular journey from join the collection, being the accession, and be reassessed into a museum collection. What exactly is the kind of cultural genealogy we have been unpacked? And I think I don't think I will be able to speak on the turn of nature. I feel very, very inadequate. However, I do think if I can re-articulate the question through thinking about how nature being naturalized by culture. And I think that's where the unique and potential, I think, historiographical question or history can be a very strong critique for the present historical writing, could be arrived through that process of reflexivity on the nature itself.
Yeah. Thank you, Fang. So while the the museum naturalizes, well, in the museum, nature is naturalized, right? It is also in the museum that it can be reactivated, no? Curatorially. Or enlivened, no? Or given another natural life, no? Through certain techniques of curation, I suppose. So anyway, that's for another seminar. But I now move on to the next question, and I'd like Marcel and Kathleen to begin the response. So the question is: as contemporary art increasingly involves species other than the human, how does your work gain access to the non-human as part of historical action?
Yes, thank you. Again, it's not so easy to answer, but we are thinking of that to be part of as an important role in our research processes. So, for example, in the films, we work with performers, so with human beings. But within the research and also for the writing and for the characters and for the plot of the films, non-human encounters are important and play a central role. And so, for example, now speaking of one film between spins, stops and change of directions that we did for the Singapore Biennial in 2019. And also we showed in the presentation these drawings of Karl and Anna Semper. And with certain butterflies or sea animals that they were drawing in their time in the 1860s, 1870s, when they did these travels, that partly no longer exist today. They are extinct. And for example, with one of the butterflies, a sea animal, we reanimated the movements based on the drawings together with a 3D designer. And yeah, this appears then again in the film in a small scene there. And
I can say so. Like further in the research we did last year, we went to Prague, and we tried to find that butterfly we were working on since a while. And we learned there actually before about butterflies that they got more and more instinct, like disappeared from the earth because of agriculture, actually, and of fertilizers, which we found very interesting. So the butterflies actually completely disappear also here because of like high-end fertilizers more and more. So there was one butterfly still preserved from a present by José Rizal, actually, which was actually in our research, who did send it to Napoleon Kyle. And Lucas Sequeira, one of the archivists there, told us actually the story that the Czech Republic has one of the biggest, largest amount of amateur ethnologists, actually. And the current government is making them responsible for the decline of the insects, which we found very interesting, actually. And it's actually, they say it's not the pollution, but then in general, of course, it's the pollution and the cementing and the one what I've said, also what David Harmy termed the loss of biodiversity through habitat destruction, actually. And
so these encounters are very, very interesting, And I mean, another possibility to answer this question would be on the basis of how we produce films and that we are dependent, let's say, on outside conditions like light and weather. And it's also interesting, Fangse, what you mentioned about Singapore, because we were filming there in one of the parks, national parks in Bukit Batok. And we found it interesting because this is second nature, or how you want to call it. It's like, it's a staged nature in a way. But still, I mean, you have these birds there and they live there. And when we were filming very close to an area where they were nesting. So they wanted us to go. They were trying to scare us away. And of course, and we recorded their voices, but didn't want to use them directly again. So they appeared later in a different scene, which was digitally modified by a sound artist that we worked with. So yeah, I think we have these encounters, but it's part of the other work, that, like, where it is embedded in and part of, let's say.
It's part of the mediation, no? I mean, which is which runs across their work, no? Yeah. So thank you, Kathleen and Marcel. So Yuma, please, your turn.
其实对我来讲，物件这件事情，其实在过去的30年跟我们的合作是非常密切的。就是其实以泰雅族的织品来讲，30年前其实我们所有的技艺跟技术都已经消失了，所以我们靠很多博物馆的物件去重建，从1990年开始，开始去跟物合作。那这个物件呢，其实透露了很多不同年代的一个讯息，然后我们透过在那个更早时期的一些文献啦，或是老照片啦，或者是我们的口述啦，去整理了这些东西。所以应该是说一种运动，就是1990年开始，我们就开始跟我们传统已经消失的物件开始合作，然后开始再恢复我们自己这些已经濒临，就是在我们的时代，就是我们大概差不多20几岁的那个年代，很多人告诉我们说，你们东西并不存在了啊，因为过去很长的殖民，从荷西时期、日治时期一直到民国时期，所以我们的东西很多的记忆都消失了。所以，但是我是觉得记忆这件事情是存在我们的身体里面，所以它很难去真正的去消灭它。所以当一个物件起来之后，当博物馆的物件起来之后，我们开始就有跟它之间的很多的连接，然后就是开始跟这个物件慢慢回来了之后，我们开始把这些传统的织品回到我们的生活里面，然后我们就会发现，哦，原来，其实每个不同的民族，它提供了很多独特的看世界的方法。对，所以我就觉得其实这个方式是很多的就是我们的自然民族对世界的一个贡献。那就是世界为什么发生很多的问题？那可能就是回到这个原初的这个观看世界的方式，就不会有这么多问题存在。所以其实自然是没有办法去驯化的。 那这些在博物馆的分类或者是什么，都是我们自己的心态，对我们自己的心态跟思考，去做了这些归类跟改变。其实祖先告诉我们，他们是一个没有办法去让人去驯化的一个环境。对，所以我在想，我们就是在做这些物件的时候呢，其实在过去，感觉上就是祖先他们其实是有一个平等的看法，所以人类不是最高或可控制的这些人，而是我们其实跟他是平等，而且我们互相运用，而且我们共同创作这样，所以我们常常会想到我们在用这个材料的时候，它会不会有更多的可能，然后它可以再回到空间或者是土地里头再生存这件，所以我们很多的作品都会希望它能够不是一个，所以不会是一个废材或什么的这样的概念，所以它很多都是循环的运用这样，所以我是觉得就是怎么跟这种环境的合作，其实我们不是利用，而是我们互相生存在这个空间里面，所以这也是我们的传统的那个训诫泰雅族的嘎嘎说的一个很重要的题目，对，所以也是创作里头常常要思考，生活也要思考的，
Thank you, Yuma. Thank you for the response. And Fangsu, your take, please, on the question.
Yes, I mean, thank you, Yuma. Your words of wisdom, very profound, which also remind me a Filipino filmmaker, I believe Patrick is very familiar with. His name is Kila Tahimek, and he has these beautiful terms refer artists, especially artists from third world country. I think he's referred to himself. The responsibility of artists should be the break of developmentism and the aggressiveness of capital colonialism. And I think that's absolutely true. In a sense, what is the role of contemporary practices in arts is precisely as what Yuma mentioned in her wonderful sharing just now. And it also reminds me that coming back to Patrick's question, thinking about gaining accessibility to human, non-human, I want to continue my discussion through Kitla's work, especially his use of sound in his film. One of the very unique dimensions of Kitla's work have to do with the use of ethnographic sound recording. So in a sense, from cinematic perspective, there's always a synchronization between sound and the visual, which obviously create very unique viewing experiences. However, I think the unique part of utilizing ethnographical recording does have to do with the presence of the ritual event that he is documenting, he is engaging, he converts himself into a community that has responding to not only thinking about themselves as the break for developmentism, but also as the bear, as the shoulder, the sole responsibility of the community is to shoulder the communication of the unique water irrigation system in the high mountain. So a balance between the habitats and the land and the environment itself, and it's beautifully presented in this film. However, a second dimension of utilizing and documenting and appropriating, to be honest, for earlier of his work, we'll have to go back to thinking about what exactly is the differences of this unique ritualistic celebration and instrument has been used. And for the kind of events that has been documenting and became the score of the film, which guides us through a sense of time and the ongoing of the sequence and narrative arc. Well, a lot of them are actually the kind of percussion music, which is interesting because, as mentioned by Filipino ethnomusiologist Jose Maceda has mentioned in his work, the beauty of music and cultural expression as a way of living in the region through music. You can think about the Catalan Indonesian culture as well. Is this presence of percussion also have to do with the presence of time. So unlike the string music, which have to do with the score and a very particular composition, however, the percussion music in the region obviously have to do with the resonance and the resonance between the sound and the body and the presence of time. And I think obviously we have experienced that when we are in the forest, or when I think Kathleen wonderfully mentioned experiences of documenting the bird habitats in the second nature of natural park, part of Singapore, or signature of Singapore, is that co-independentness and that shared habitats moment to that moment of sound. And I think that's the beauty to think about whether it's possible to have gain and access of non-human and human. But I think for another dimension, what we can think about is to reconsider under what circumstances of the formation of the discursive operation that can resituate human experiences back to the kind of non-human experiences, and which distinguish or limited operation of our work in humanity, which taken away the percussion and the reverberance of the body with the sound, which has wonderfully been mobilized in Kirata Himek's work.
Thank you. Thank you, Fang Tzu. And I stay with you for the last question. So in the interest of time, we can be brief in the response to this last question. So we can talk about the future in your practice. So looking towards the future of your practice, reflecting on the phrase ecologies of history, what aspects of this discourse of ecology and history are you currently exploring or wish to explore? So we begin with you, Fang Tzu.
I'll keep it pretty short. So thank you for the invitation to reconsider my own practice in this particular framework of ecology of history. I'm not a person with optimistic view of the future. So in the past few years, my work has been dived up into history in the kind of formation of the past. So in the past few years, and what I'm going to continue to do is to actually revisit landscape painting. In the early history, in the formation of Chinese cosmology in painting itself, and that's has part of the result has been manifest in the recent exhibition, which I collaborated with Kathleen Disick, which I'm going to continue to do that. And the second phase that I'm working on is regarding the overseas Chinese in the region and that reappropriation of the ink and how does that adopt into the region itself. So I think in a sense, thinking through reappropriation, but at the same time thinking through that rearticulation of cosmology and possibly thinking about that moment of encounter or zone of encounter having been created and documented through visuals, through art history.
Yeah, and maybe comes to the sound of ink painting.
Yes.
The brush.
The sonic dimension of the ink painting. I'm taking note, Patrick.
Okay, thank you. And Marcel and Kathleen, what about the future in your work?
Yeah, we are currently, we started last year with a new research and are currently still researching in the archives. The practice of an older and also a bit forgotten, gone under artist, writer and filmmaker in Germany. Her name is Erika Runge. And so we are mainly going into the archives at the moment and reading the interviews that she conducted from the 60s to the 80s. In this period of time, she was active as an artist. And later she became a psychotherapist and gave up filmmaking and writing.
Wow.
And
maybe just to say the interviews are very interesting. She's self-taught actually as becoming a psychotherapist because she comes more from theater and art history. But the idea of the interview is very interesting for us, and also the development actually of the self, because she mostly interviewed female workers actually, and also like to see in the last decades how this all changed in terms of neoliberal times. It's quite interesting for us. So yeah, that's something we're working a lot on.
Yeah, and also like then we were thinking how to, you know, value her like methodology that she developed and this specific practice of interviewing and working with it, and how we relate with our methodology and practice in relation to it. So we are still figuring this out, but it will have be probably to do in terms of topic or theme or whatever, again with the climate change, and we're still thinking what exactly, but taking this from the last work and going further with it, I think.
Wow, it sounds exciting, huh? Marcel and Kathleen. We're looking forward to that project.
Thank you, Patrick.
And finally, Yuma, as we started with you, so we end with you.
OK， 对我来讲，就是未来要做的事情，其实跟我的传统的历史跟经验也是有很大的关联，因为我们的文化里头都认为，就是人不是最大的，所以就不可以以自己为中心的这种心情跟态度，所以我接下来其实做了一个工作，因为我真的不是一个纯粹的艺术家，所以我会为了我的族群的生存去考虑，所以我接下来的工作其实就是把我们传统的那种编织用的植物，就是苎麻，rami，这个植物呢，去展开它所有的可利用的一个历程，让它完全都不浪费。比如说，我们开始去把苎麻的叶子变成饲料，然后去养鸡养鱼，然后把它的杆子把它做成3D 列印的材料，然后把它的根做成治肝癌的药，然后把它的皮革把它的那个纤维去做成皮革。所以其实这一些工作都是希望能够在资本主义底下，我们台湾的原住民不会变成贫穷限制下的，我们永远在被利用跟剥削的，所以我们想要创造一个自给自足的环境，让即便是在我们的小小部落里头，它可以因为这个传统知识，然后跟现代的结合，让我们能够自给自足。所以我在想，其实人跟植物之间，还有环境之间，它其实一个很完整的生态系统。所以其实我在想，如果这件事情能够真的为我的族群达成那个自给自足，我觉得就是一个非常好的作品。
Thank you, Yuma. This idea of survival and also emancipation, I think, ran across all of your presentations, and it's good to end on that note. And I'd like to thank the participants of this session, Yuma and Elliot, the translator interpreter. Thank you, Marcel and Kathleen. Thank you very much, and of course, Fang Su. Thank you very much. So I also would like to thank everyone for coming to the Zoom room and joining us virtually. So thank you.